Hello there, and welcome to the first last edit of 2019. This is a weekly podcast with my great friend and wonderful film lover,
Silver Hawkins.
and I'm Citizen Sleeve. And every week we discuss a different film that we've chosen the prior week, and often they're rather obscure. This one, maybe not quite so obscure, but a very interesting film, and I thought it apt in the new year to discuss a film that, in some ways, is set around that period. So today we're going to be talking about Kathryn Bigelow's 1995 film Strange Days. It's an odd one because Kathryn Bigelow, for three or four films in her early career, things like Blue Steel, was critically acclaimed but didn't really do the box office that would have pushed her career on to what she did later in stuff like The Hurt Locker. But it's a very interesting film. So Ray Fiennes plays a character called Lenny Nero, who is a black market dealer in something called the squid or wire. What's it called? Wire tripping. Yeah, and he sells tapes, which are almost VR first-person perceptual subjectiveness of people's memories, so you can experience someone's memory. And there's a number of different plots that run through the film. There's basically it's set just before the millennium of 2000, and this technology gets embroiled in a big conspiracy. And Lenny used to be this ex-cop. He's obsessed with his ex-girlfriend called Faith, and he's kind of lost faith in things around him. And he constantly rewatches memories of Juliette Lewis's Faith that he had when he recorded her when he was with her. And she's now with this kind of very paranoid drug dealer, record producer called Philo, played by Michael Wincott, who is exactly the same character Michael Wincott always plays because he's Michael Wincott. Same character as the Crow, essentially, but still very cool. He's got a friend called Max, who is played by Tom Sizemore, who is also in and around this kind of industry, this black market industry, and was a cop as well. And then his friend called Mace, who's played by Angela Bassett, who's this limo driver, but is rarely there to protect him. This film deals with things like racism. It deals with things like police brutality and the recording of police brutality, which we see now in modern culture. And this film kind of is a precursor to that in many ways.
Well, no,
But
I
in
mean, it came in the wake of Rodney King.
Rodney
So,
King, absolutely, and there's hints, not just hints. There's massive shout
yeah.
outs to that particular event in American history throughout the film. So the main core plot is there is a serial killer raping and killing girls while having them in the squid headset, so it's recorded. And at the same time, a famous rapper, a civil rights activist as well, called Jericho One, has also been killed on tape by two police officers, played by Michael Fitchner and Vincent D'Onofrio. And all this stuff kind of weaves together to create this massive conspiracy. It's got a lot of cyberpunk vibes. It's got a lot of kind of tech gone wrong vibes, and it's set in
Noir.
LA, which is and noir, of course, and set in LA, which is in chaos at the time. So it's quite a convoluted plot. So I'll pass it over to you. What were your initial thoughts when you watched it for the first time?
Actually, I think I've seen it before, but
Oh, okay.
it just didn't really. It's been so long, and I mean, I had déjà vu after I'd watched it, that a feeling that I'd seen it before. But going into it, I didn't remember it. Um, but I enjoyed it a lot. As I watched it, it was only towards the end that it really started to completely fall apart.
Hmm.
Like technically, feel it's really well executed. The first person, I mean, the main technical aspect of the movie are the first person sequences,
Hmm.
which are executed really, really, really well. Like the first one you see is the one with recorded from a robbery, from a
Yeah.
robber's perspective. Like they're not really memories as such; they're recorded experiences because they're recorded live. They're not recollections as such. They're
So yeah.
live recorded experiences of people. That's why there's a sort of corner market for snuff films. People
Yeah.
dying that finds this character Nero basically stays away from. He has this sort of personal code that he doesn't deal in snuff films. Um, but yeah, I mean the first person sequences are really striking. The most the film has arguably one of the most uncomfortable rape scenes in film history. I would argue.
Yeah. Oh, very much so.
Where Iris, Nero's and Faith's friend, is raped and murdered by an unseen assailant. And he basically makes her view. He hooks her up to the wire so that she gets to see and feel his experience raping and killing her, which is unsettling on so many levels.
It is, and until the very end, it really commits to placing the viewer, the spectator, in a position where, because it's perceptual subjectiveness, because it's first person, you experience these horrific things, through the film. And not many films do that. Normally, it's you're in the place of the killer, for instance, like Peeping Tom. Or it's some other kind of mechanic used to place the viewer in an uncomfortable position, but not very often the victim. And that first part, the robbery, that's like 4 minutes of unbroken first person footage, which really kind of dumps you into this world really quickly, and quite effectively.
And I mean, there's a lot of I think I could probably call it casual authenticity. Like the nudity, there's nudity in the film, but it's never gratuitous. It's always like, it makes sense. It feels authentic, like in Nero's memories or his recorded experiences with Faith, his ex-girlfriend. Like in those experiences, the nudity there feels completely appropriate and intimate. It has a really authentic feel to it. Like it doesn't really pull any punches in that regard. It doesn't censor itself. The violence is uncomfortable. Like Nero gets beaten up quite a bit, quite a few times. He's a bit of a pathetic character, really.
Yeah.
Like he's a sleaze. He's a former vice cop himself. Got kicked off the force. And is now peddling in these sort of recorded experiences, and you can see the appeal. I mean, he's basically addicted to them himself, as you noted. He sits in his apartment much of the time and just stones out on either his memories with Faith or whatever new videos he gets that he samples before passing them on.
It's quite an interesting look at what technology would become and has become and maybe could become even further in terms of the technology being developed now through VR, higher end VR, AR, and of course, trying to work out how the human brainwaves work to control things and all this mad tech. But it's very grounded. And we've talked about things before that have been retrofitted, and this world feels retrofitted. It feels lived in. It feels breathed in.
Yeah.
And the characters, they're all really quite difficult characters with difficult backgrounds who've gone through all kinds of horrible stuff that you can actually relate to some extent. Mace, I find a particularly interesting character because she's in love with Nero, and he doesn't see it for some reason. He's so obsessed with Faith and this idealistic version of these recorded, live memory events of Faith that he's vicariously living his life through that rather than seeing what's in front of him, which is this wonderfully, powerfully independent woman who is protecting him throughout the entire narrative of the film. I think that's very interesting. The other really
she's
striking,
the most earnest character in the film.
Exactly, yeah. She's the most trustworthy. She's the most honest. She says it how it is, and she's played straight down the line by Angela Bassett in this world of sleazeballs and sleazebags and scum and underhanded stuff going on. It's interesting how the black market works as well. How it's almost like a drug trade because it's an addictive thing. You want the next hit of the most serious or most violent or most egregious thing you can see through these different recordings, and people get completely addicted to it as if it's some class A drug.
Yeah, I mean it's the same thing that drugs are for you. It's escapism. And this is like literal. You get to be in the shoes of someone else, feel their emotions, their fears, their pleasures.
The ultimate escapism in many ways.
Yeah, precisely.
It's a very grim and grimy world that Bigelow creates. It's very reminiscent of what we'd expect a dystopian future to be. but it takes this very kind of different tact about everything. Normally, in a dystopian world, there'd be something that should be very common, which is incredibly difficult to get hold of. You know, water, spice in June. You know, there's these things, but in Strange Days, it's not. It's this thing that's proliferated across the world and has become this black market undercurrent that supports this kind of new violent and vile society that echoes many of the kind of racist elements of that period in time and now as well.
Yeah, I mean, as we mentioned, this came out in the wake of the Rodney King shootings, which have fingerprints all over this film and are sadly as relevant today as they were, 25 years ago. With Black Lives Matter and so forth. I mean, the police brutality angle on it. The murder of Jericho for no good reason is just basically to cover up the fact that two cops pulled him over for no reason, and they pulled over the wrong guy because he actually has influence to push back, and called them out on the fact that they pulled them over for no reason.
Yeah.
And they might actually face consequences for it, so they shoot him.
Yeah.
And I mean, and there, unfortunately for them, there are witnesses to this.
So the sex worker who's actually part of Philo's crew, who's the current boyfriend of Faith. See, like, I sort of link all the characters together.
Yeah.
But Iris is the sex worker who's there and present when Jericho 1 is murdered, and she has a squid on and live records the whole event and her running away and escaping, and she's eventually killed by what becomes the serial killer. It's very obvious throughout the film who it's going to be, but Max, who is played by Tom Sizemore, it's signposted so obviously that I really like this film. It's certainly nowhere near perfect. It's got a lot of problems, and the major one is the ending, and one of the problems is Max, because throughout the film the tells that he is the serial killer are so obvious. You'd have to be blind to not realize it. It's like not realizing that Bruce Willis's character is a ghost in Sixth Sense. You know, it's so obvious. But the mise en scène in particular fascinates me in this film. It's like Blade Runner got even dirtier. This really horrible, grubby kind of race-ridden, misogynistic, horrible undercurrent that runs throughout LA. You know, like the end times are coming almost, which is why it's so interesting that it's set just before the millennium, when everything kind of peaks. And the narrative builds really nicely up until that point. I like a lot of the characters as well. You know, the cops are played really nastily. But Vincent D'Onofrio is absolutely brilliant in one of those roles. I think Ray Fiennes pulls off this sleazy, unconfident, hurt, paranoid. Paranoia is a big theme in this film.
Yeah.
Philo in particular, but so many characters are paranoid about what's going on around them, what they're seeing. Is it real? Is it not real? What reality are we actually living in?
I didn't really get that. I mean, I didn't really get the reality questioning aspect as an element of the film. I don't know.
Well, just in terms of like Philo in the end is so messed up by what he's.
No, Philo is, but that's not really him. That's the paranoia that gets to him, because he's using it all day, every day, basically.
Yeah, and blurring those lines, and because of course the squid is a literal live memory. There's no distinguishing between that and reality, apart from the fact you've got a headset on. A bit like Existence to some extent.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, that's true. But yeah, I mean, the ending has a number of issues. I mean, it's not just a lot of issues. It's like throughout the film, Nero pines for his ex-girlfriend Faith, and pursues her, and she keeps sort of denying him. Ostensibly because she doesn't love him anymore, but we see in scenes between Faith and Philo that she actually does, and that she's sort of been trying to protect him. Which also makes the ending all the more mystifying to me. Because eventually, I mean, he confronts Tom Sizemore's character as the serial killer. thinking that he's there to hurt and kill Faith. Because Sizemore's character throughout the film with his victims, he leaves recordings of his killings to Nero, in a personalized envelope. And so he leaves a recording of himself having sex with Faith in a similar way to how he raped and killed Iris, leaving Nero to fear that he murdered Faith. But it then turns out that he's actually had an affair with Faith and that they plotted together to kill Philo, and that Max plotted to frame Nero for all of the murders, which is where the plot starts to fall apart. He tries to kill Nero, which is when Faith intervenes and saves Nero, and Nero and Max then fight, and Max gets pushed off a balcony and falls to his death in a scene that looked very much like, nearly identical to, what's the film with Clint Eastwood and John Malkovich? Where Malkovich is the assassin trying to kill the president, and Eastwood is...
in Line of Sight?
In the Line of Fire, right?
In Line of Sight. The Line of Fire, sorry.
Yeah, I think that's what it's called, where Malkovich falls to his death at the end from the hotel balcony. Pretty much the same. It's like the identical shot for shot, from what I remember. Yeah, and then he falls to his death. And then we don't see Faith anymore, because then Nero goes to see Max and says, "Oh, I love you," and then they kiss, and that's basically the end of the movie. It's a resolution that has no satisfaction at all. It doesn't feel appropriate. It doesn't feel earned. It just feels like it's there. It feels very James Cameron-y in a way.
Yeah, it does, and he wrote the film, and or co-wrote the film, and you're right that it's got a number of problems. This film, I mean, part of the problem is so many things are too overt. So, for instance, even calling Juliette Lewis's character Faith with this detective who's lost Faith, who's trying to find Faith, is like it's a bit too obvious. But the ending is a neat bow which sorts out all the plot threads for no reason, and everything is fine and hunky dory at the end. And the two people are supposed to get together.
Yeah, and also the scene where where Mace is fighting the two dirty cops in the crowd, and then they're about to basically beat her to death in front of like 100 to 200 people, instead of like just carrying her off into a van and then beating her to death inside the van. Like they're standing there beating her in front of...
In the middle of New Year's Eve on the most popular street in LA almost, or something. And it's like she... I'm not sure what happened with Bigelow in that particular... I mean, you can see maybe Cameron's influence a bit too much, because it's like a carbon copy of the footage of Rodney King. You know, it's like, right... Stephen Lawrence, Rodney King, these 90s era racist, police brutality kind of attacks. At the end, we're going to make sure everyone knows exactly what we've been talking about. There you go, carbon copy. And it just doesn't work. It doesn't work. Max is too obvious as the killer. We know that and then so early on in the film.
And you have the police commissioner suddenly intervening then. Comes in, saves her, arrests the two dirty cops, and happy ending.
Exactly, yeah.
Out of nowhere. It's a Deus Ex Machina, out of nowhere, basically, right?
It is, but it's so poorly handled. You know, it's like a griffin flying down in Lord of the Rings and swooping off the heroes. It's so obvious. So yeah, this film has a lot of problems, I think, but it's still an interesting
really
film
made.
to watch.
Really interesting concept, really interesting set design. Effects are really solid. Still hold up today. Acting's pretty good. As you touched on, Ralph Fiennes is good as Nero. Like, he has the most soulful eyes of any working actor, I think Fiennes does. Like, it's amazing. Just like there's so much character just in those eyes.
Well, you can tell the struggle he's been through and where he's come from. He's this vice cop, as you said, who's been through an incredible amount of stuff and has entered this illegal trade and is uncomfortable with it and is uncomfortable with the snuff movies and is obsessed with this ex-girlfriend, and he pulls all of that off. I think the cast is pretty good. I mean, I said Michael Wincott is Michael Wincott, but that's because he's always Michael Wincott. That's fine. We love Michael Wincott. But Juliette Lewis, although a bit one note, plays her character fairly well. I think Tom Sizemore is perhaps a bit underused at times, but again, probably a good choice for that role. It just needed to be a lot more hidden within the narrative, something which we could have found out more.
I think what really annoyed me the most about Max's character wasn't how predictable it was that he was the killer so much, but that it felt completely like there was no real point to the cruelty with which he killed.
Mm.
Like it's just there to sort of outrage us or make us uncomfortable. That was the only reason. It wasn't there as sort of a character trait, or it didn't feel like a character trait for him. It didn't really feel like there was any personal motivation for him to do it in that way.
There did feel like a huge disconnect between the character, who is really kind of this off the cuff, kind of cool but weird side character who supports Nero throughout, and then suddenly, he's this atrocious, truly horrific serial killer,
Yeah.
who is way beyond the pale in terms of what he puts his victims through. So there's no indication or no, the foreshadowing is there, but it's so obvious. There's no build up to the character. We find out why he might have a motivation to be so truly brutal to these women.
Yeah, and I mean, not just the women, the men, the two men he kills.
Yeah.
He basically just overloads their brains on the squid, so that there's basically just overloaded with images all the time, and in a sort of catatonic state.
Almost like Clockwork Orange, like bombardments, yeah, in order to cause the brain to go,
Yeah,
whoop, bye-bye.
basically, yeah.
Yeah, I would suggest people watch it. It's a very dark noir thriller. It deals with issues
It's a cult film.
It is a cult film, and it deals with issues that are incredibly prevalent today, especially in racism terms in pockets of America and pockets of Europe throughout the world.
But it doesn't do it subtly. It does it pretty much hitting you over the head with a sledgehammer.
Yeah, it's very overt. It's very in your face. It's not exactly a film that is suggestive. It's more, as you said, like a sledgehammer to the face in meaning terms. But as you said, it's really quite beautifully shot. Even though it's grimy, it's this dirty version of LA that's become very dystopian. It still has that wonderful film noir kind of aesthetic to it that fits with some of the classics that we know, like Blade Runner, etc. Fifth Element to some extent.
And some of the best first-person sequences you'll see in film.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's not many films that pull off first-person very well at all. The Doom sequence in that horrible version of the film from the video game.
There was that video game film, was it Something Henry?
Hardcore Henry.
Hardcore Henry, yeah. I never saw it, but from what I hear, it didn't execute it very well.
No, there's also a Clive Owen action film. I can't remember the name of it now. That came out before Hardcore Henry that also had first-person elements. The film that stands out to me whenever we talk about first person in particular is Peeping Tom, which is Michael Powell. We obviously watched Powell and Pressburger's Black Narcissus for, I think, our first podcast. And basically the second podcast. And basically this young man is killing women with the edge of a tripod that he's taken off and sharpened. And we get that perceptual subjectiveness through that character. But this is one of the only films, as we discussed, that I think puts you in the place of the victim. I think those sequences are probably the most successful in the whole film.
Yeah, because you're powerless, like the victim. Yeah. You can only sit by and watch, as it were.
Well, absolutely. It's odd, actually. I watched the International podcast the other day, and you were talking about a game where there's a Syrian refugee that you're married to, and you feel so powerless because...
Bury Me, My Love, yeah.
Yeah, and I imagine it's that same kind... Not the same kind of feeling, because it's a different kind of feeling. You're a husband, you have that attachment in the game. But it's the same kind of situational perspective where you're placed somewhere where you can't do anything about it, and you can only be an onlooker to this incredible violence and this incredible hatred that goes on before you in first person, which obviously puts you in that situation more effectively.
Yeah. And I mean, it's also, there is that, I mean, we've touched on the political commentary and so forth, but there's also the sort of uncomfortable voyeuristic commentary in terms of what we consume for entertainment, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And especially in a modern era now where we've talked about things like VR And obviously, things like pornography, it often drives technology, and VR is already incredibly popular for that, and the voyeuristic nature of it. And that actually links quite nicely back to Michael Powell's Peeping Tom, because that film is all about voyeurism. The idea of being a filmmaker and filming murders through a camera as you direct, essentially. A little bit different in this film. It's far more horrific in the way that you're placed in the victim's perspective, but the notion of not just being recorded from the outside, being recorded everywhere, even your memories.
Yeah. And again, like, just the concept that we're using like snuff films and death and violence against others as entertainment, like going back to ancient Rome, in the gladiatorial arena, and that we are basically still at that point as a society, is, I think, worth commenting on and talking about. And the film does do that, I think, in a pretty compelling way.
Yeah, absolutely. Right, well, that was Strange Days. I think we both quite liked it. It's got its problems. The ending
Yeah, I
isn't
would
great.
recommend it as well. Yeah.
Yeah. Go and watch it. Tell us what you think in the comments about it. It's a really unique and interesting film. It's kind of a bit existence. It's a bit cyberpunk. It's got some very interesting themes and some great performances. It just falls flat towards that end.
Yeah,
and
I mean, don't feel too badly if you switch it off like 5 or 10 minutes before the ending.
Yeah, you're not missing much. I mean, everything ties up so nicely. It might as well have been a typical Hollywood film. But hey, go and watch it. I really like a lot of elements of it. So
Yeah.
So right then, Mr. Silver Hawkins, sir, what shall we be purveying next Sunday?
We shall be purveying a 2008 Israeli film called Waltz with Bashir, which is directed and written by Ari Folman, an Israeli filmmaker, and is basically about his recollections of his service in the Israeli Defense Force during the Lebanese Civil War in 1982.
Excellent, good
And
stuff.
it's an animated sort of documentary. Was nominated for an Academy Award that year for Best Foreign Film.
Really interesting. And as always, we shall see you again next Sunday on the Last Edit podcast.
We shall indeed. Take care.
Take it easy.